Scroll through social media right now, and it feels less like a conversation and more like a public brawl. On one side, baby boomers get painted as gatekeepers of wealth and power, clinging to old rules and refusing to step aside. On the other, millennials and Gen Z are louder than ever, talking about burnout, rising costs, identity, and a future that keeps getting pushed further away. The arguments never stop. The outrage refreshes every hour. But if you zoom out just a little, there's another group sitting quietly off to the side, not trending, not yelling, not writing long threads, just watching it all unfold with a coffee in hand and a faint, knowing smirk that says, "Yeah, I've seen this movie before." That group is Generation X. Born roughly between the mid-1960s and the early 1980s, Gen X is the forgotten middle child of modern history. Too young to fully benefit from the economic highs that came before them, too old to be framed as the struggling youth everyone rallies around now. Most of the time, they barely get mentioned at all until something breaks. Then suddenly, they're expected to step in and quietly fix it. That invisibility wasn't an accident. Gen X didn't just fade into the background. They were conditioned to live there. And when you grow up learning early on that no one is coming to rescue you, it doesn't just shape your habits or your work ethic. It rewires how you see the world, how you relate to people, and how you survive emotionally. This isn't just history. This is a psychological profile. This is the psychology of Generation X, the silent observers of the culture war. To understand the Gen X mindset, you have to go back to where it was first programmed, not in adulthood, not in the workplace, but in childhood. And the defining image of a Gen X childhood isn't a crowded dinner table or a parent waiting by the door. It's a house key hanging from a string around a kid's neck. During the 1970s and 80s, families quietly shifted. Divorce rates climbed. Two-income households became the norm. More women entered the workforce, a huge step forward for society, but it also created a gap no one really knew how to fill. Childcare lagged behind reality, so millions of kids adapted on their own. They became latchkey kids. Picture it, the school bus pulls away. It's mid-afternoon, you walk home alone. The street is quiet. You unlock the door, step inside, and the house answers you with silence. No one asks how your day was. No one reminds you what to do next. Just the hum of appliances, the glow of the TV, the sense that you're on your own until further notice. You make your own snack. You do homework half watching whatever's on. If you get hurt, you deal with it. If you feel scared, you push it down. If you feel lonely, you don't have language for it yet, so you just sit with it. Psychologists might call this benign neglect. Not abuse, not cruelty, just being physically safe while emotionally unsupervised. And that environment wires a child's brain in a very specific way. When you're young and no one is coming to check on you, you learn a lesson that sticks for life. Help is not automatic. Comfort is optional. And attention is something you either earn or live without. That's where Gen X's reputation for independence really comes from. But independence wasn't a personality choice. It was a requirement. And over time, that requirement did something deeper than just teaching self-reliance. It taught invisibility. When you grow up feeling unseen, you don't just learn how to take care of yourself. You learn how to take up less space. You learn to need less, ask less, and expect less. You solve problems quietly, handle things internally, and eventually you stop signaling that you need anything at all. What starts as a coping mechanism slowly hardens into identity. Here's the part most people miss. Those kids didn't stop needing connection. They stopped expecting it. They grew into adults who can endure almost anything but hesitate when it comes time to ask for help. Adults who can carry pain, work through stress, and stay functional under pressure, yet don't quite know how to be supported inside that pain. That's the real Gen X origin story. Not spoiled, not broken, just shaped early to disappear when things got heavy, to stay out of the way, to handle it themselves. And once a nervous system learns that rule, it doesn't forget it easily. One of the biggest misunderstandings about Generation X is the idea that they're emotionally distant or cold. They're not. They're compressed. The feelings are there, sometimes intense, sometimes heavy. But they were raised in a culture where emotional expression was treated like a nuisance. If you were sad, you were told to toughen up. If you were anxious, you were told to deal with it. If you cried, you were told you were being dramatic. So Gen X learned a skill that looks like emotional intelligence from the outside, but often isn't. They learned emotional minimalism. Say less, ask for less, need less, at least out loud. That's why a Gen Xer rarely says, "I'm overwhelmed." They say, "I'm fine." They don't say, "I miss you." They say, "You still alive?" And when they care about you, they don't lead with words. They lead with action. They fix things. They show up. They handle problems before you even realize there was a problem. That's their love language, because action feels safer than vulnerability. And the sarcasm people associate with Gen X, that's not cruelty. It's packaging, a way to leak emotion without exposing it, to share anxiety without turning it into a scene, to stay connected while keeping the armor on. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Gen X didn't grow up learning how to talk about their feelings. They grew up learning how to function through them. And that creates a very specific kind of adult, emotionally capable on the surface, but emotionally unavailable underneath. They can support everyone else while quietly sidelining themselves, not because they don't care, but because the rule they internalized early was simple and absolute. Feel it privately, handle it alone, move on. That's where the paradox shows up. The same trait that made Gen X strong is the same trait that often makes them lonely. When independence starts as survival, it doesn't feel optional later. The nervous system doesn't say, "I can do this." It says, "I have to." So they struggle to receive help even when they need it. Venting feels pointless. Reaching out feels unnecessary, or worse, burdensome. Not because no one would show up, but because some part of them still expects that no one will. Over time, that expectation becomes isolation, not the obvious kind. They can have careers, families, friendships, but there's often a quiet loneliness underneath it all, born from being the reliable one for too long. This is why therapy can feel strange for many Gen Xers. Not because they reject the idea of it, but because vulnerability doesn't come naturally. It feels like a language they were never taught. Their inner dialogue still echoes with the same instruction they learned as kids. Handle it. Don't bother anyone. Hyper-independence is a superpower. It makes you competent, resilient, unshakable in a crisis. But if you never learn how to be supported, that same strength can quietly turn into a cage. You become very good at surviving and very bad at resting inside someone else's care. If hyper-independence is the engine of the Gen X psyche, then cynicism is the armor. And that armor didn't form randomly. It was forged in an era where trust kept collapsing in public. They watched Watergate teach the country that leaders lie. The Cold War taught them the future wasn't guaranteed. The Challenger explosion showed them that even hope could fail, suddenly and publicly. Safety felt provisional. Stability felt fragile. So Gen X adapted. They learned not to fully buy in, not to give their heart to systems or stories that would probably disappoint them. Cynicism wasn't bitterness, it was protection. Then came the 1980s, loud, glossy, relentlessly optimistic on the surface, while something underneath felt off. Gen X was the first generation raised inside nonstop advertising. Saturday morning cartoons blended seamlessly into commercials. Malls became social centers. Everything was selling something, promising happiness, success, or identity. And over time, their brains adjusted. They developed a finely tuned internal alarm system, a built-in filter for nonsense. That's where the famous Gen X whatever really comes from. It doesn't mean they don't care. It means they're not going to hand their emotions over to something that hasn't earned trust yet. Psychologically, it's expectation management. Keep hopes low enough and disappointment loses its power. That's why Gen X doesn't respond to hype. Political slogans, corporate mission statements, personal branding, life-changing programs that promise transformation in 30 days, all of it triggers skepticism. They've seen too many shiny stories fall apart. If you want a Gen Xer's respect, there's only one thing that works: authenticity, not the polished version, the real one. To Gen X, an ugly truth feels safer than a beautiful lie. Cognitively, Gen X occupies a position no other generation ever will in quite the same way. They were raised in two different worlds. Their early life was analog, physical, slow. They rode bikes without tracking, got lost and had to figure it out, memorized phone numbers, read maps, lived in a world where boredom existed. And boredom did something important. It forced creativity, it trained patience, it built focus and real-world problem-solving in ways that are hard to replicate now. Then, just as they were coming of age, everything shifted. Personal computers, email, dial-up internet, cell phones. An entirely new reality arrived, and Gen X didn't just witness it, they adapted to it. They learned both systems. That makes them psychologically bilingual. Boomers often struggle to intuitively trust new tech. Younger generations often struggle to imagine solutions that don't involve an app. Gen X can move between both without much friction. They can troubleshoot a printer, reset a router, open a spreadsheet, and still handle a problem the old-fashioned way when technology fails. They speak hierarchy and flexibility, professionalism and informality. But living between two worlds has a cost. They never fully relaxed into either one. That constant switching creates a quiet exhaustion Gen X rarely names. They built the digital future while still carrying analog responsibilities. They're the ones helping their parents log into accounts while training younger co-workers on systems that predate them. Two speeds, two realities, one nervous system. Gen X isn't the loudest voice in the room. But when something actually needs to get done, they're usually the ones doing it. That's not just a stereotype, it's conditioning. Latchkey kids weren't coached through problems, they improvised, they fixed things, they cleaned up messes without applause. So as adults, Gen X became the generation of invisible labor, the ones who keep systems running while everyone else debates the system. They don't need motivational speeches, they need fewer obstacles. This is also why Gen X has a deep intolerance for micromanagement. It doesn't just irritate them, it feels like distrust. And in their nervous system, distrust feels personal. When control shows up, it triggers something old, a quiet internal response that says, "You think I can't handle this?" So they don't revolt loudly, they resist quietly. They do the work, avoid the politics, skip the unnecessary meetings, and protect their autonomy like it's oxygen. For Gen X, independence isn't a preference, it's identity. To understand where Gen X is now, you have to look at the weight they're carrying. Most of them are in their 40s and 50s, living inside what psychologists call the sandwich generation, pulled hard in two directions at once. On one side are aging parents, baby boomers living longer than any generation before them, often with chronic illness, cognitive decline, or complex medical needs. Gen X is the one making appointments, managing medications, navigating insurance, answering late-night calls that start with, "Something's wrong." On the other side are their children, Gen Z and Gen Alpha, growing up in an economy that feels unforgiving. Tuition costs, housing prices, mental health struggles, social media pressure, a job market that doesn't promise stability. These kids don't just need financial support, they need emotional presence. They need parents who can hold them steady. And in the middle of it all, Gen X is still expected to perform at work like none of this exists. This is the generation that entered adulthood just as pensions disappeared and retirement became a personal responsibility. They lived through the dot-com crash, took major hits during the 2008 financial crisis, and then watched the ground shift again during the pandemic. What this creates psychologically is a form of burnout that doesn't look like burnout. Gen X doesn't usually fall apart publicly. They don't announce breakdowns. They just keep going. They wake up early, take care of everyone else, show up to work, handle emergencies, pay the bills, clench their jaw at night, and do it all again tomorrow. This is why Gen X is especially vulnerable to something dangerous and easy to miss: high-functioning depression. You can be productive and still be depressed. You can be responsible and still be overwhelmed. You can be the dependable one and still be quietly unraveling. The latchkey kids who learned to ask for nothing and grew into adults everyone asks everything from. And because they were trained not to complain, they don't say, "I can't do this anymore." They say, "I'm fine." And then they keep pushing until their body or their mind eventually forces a pause. This is where Gen X starts taking hits from both sides. Boomers can see them as detached or disengaged. Younger generations can see them as blunt or emotionally stiff. The truth is, Gen X often doesn't feel fully understood by either group. In relationships, they care deeply, but they show it differently. They communicate love through consistency, reliability, and presence. They don't always speak in emotional paragraphs. They show up, they fix things. They stay steady when life gets chaotic. But because they learn to self-contain, intimacy can feel risky. Depending on someone can feel like weakness. So they love and guard themselves at the same time. Parenting brings its own contradictions. Many Gen X parents are determined to give their kids the support that they didn't have, while still believing that struggle builds resilience. So they can sound tough even when they're trying to protect. They'll say, "Figure it out," while quietly making sure the fall isn't fatal. Culturally, Gen X tends to value freedom over performance. They're generally open to difference, but deeply allergic to hypocrisy. They don't mind who you are. They mind being lied to. They can respect identity without applauding moral theater. That leaves them, once again, in the middle. Too soft for the old guard, too hard for the new one. Rarely feeling fully at home in either camp. Often thinking quietly, "No one really gets us." And just as quietly deciding they don't have the energy to explain. As Gen X moves past midlife, something subtle but powerful begins to happen. After decades of survival mode, of handling everything and needing nothing, many start to reassess. Not in a dramatic collapse, but in a deliberate shift. They leave jobs that pay well but feel empty. They downsize, they start small businesses, they make art, they simplify. Not because they're reckless, but because they've finally done the math. They played the game, and the reward didn't justify the cost. And this is where healing begins. Gen X is learning that independence doesn't require isolation, that strength doesn't demand silence, that it's allowed to be tired, allowed to need help, allowed to choose themselves. If you're Gen X and this resonated, you already know why.